Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching the Base Politics Show. It's been a little over a year since the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, the race-conscious policy that governed college admissions for decades. In the case, Asian students argued that Harvard and UNC admissions discriminated against them and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The court agreed with them. Now, the enrollment numbers for the first year without affirmative action in charge are trickling in, and they're interesting, to say the least. MIT revealed a significant drop in admissions for Black and Hispanic students, while white enrollment stayed about the same and Asian enrollment shot up 6%. The University of Virginia, Tufts University, and Amherst College also released their data, showing dips in their Black enrollment too, down 1.4%, 2.6%, and 8% respectively. In other words, it's going exactly as both opponents and proponents of affirmative action predicted. So, what to do now? Everyone agrees diversity is a good and desired outcome, one that fosters a greater capacity for understanding and a richer learning environment. But most Americans feel strongly that we cannot sacrifice merit to achieve diversity, me included. So that means we have to start at the root of the problem, which is, why are some demographics less equipped academically than others? But before we dive into this episode, make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel if you have not already, and of course, ring the notification bell so you never miss one of my episodes. Okay, guys, to help me unpack today's subject matter, I am so excited to introduce you to a guest. Ian Rowe is an educator, he's an entrepreneur, he's the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at the Woodson Center. So he's quite accomplished. And I asked him to join me today because I was already interested in covering this subject matter, but I came across a tweet from him and I could not agree more. He wrote, "The percent of Black kids entering MIT went down by almost the exact amount that the percent of Asian students went up, and white student percent decreased. My strong suspicion is that the Black students who didn't get in have been welcomed at a myriad of strong schools with generous financial aid packages, and no one is doubting that the Black kids who did get into MIT didn't earn it. That terrible stereotype is gone. But of course, this is all a big distraction. According to the National Assessment for Educational Progress, less than 20% of all Black kids emerge from 12th grade reading at grade level. The combination of unstable families and lack of access to high-quality education due to opposition to school choice in K through 12 continues to wreak havoc on Black kids. That's the real issue if we have the courage to confront it, which I very much want to. So first and foremost, Ian, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for agreeing to be here. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you got into your line of work?
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for covering this crucial issue. It does seem like we are so distracted on this sort of orb of college admissions, which we should talk about, when the real issue is what's happening in K-12 education. I have run public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan since 2010, almost exclusively low-income Black and Hispanic kids at the elementary level, middle, and now at high school. And all of our students want to compete on equal footing. They want access to a high-quality education. They don't want to believe that they need this crutch at the point at which they're entering college admissions because of their race in order to have a shot to get in because they didn't get a good education leading up to that. And that's the fundamental issue. You know, in 2015, the National Assessment for Educational Progress rated Black fourth graders in terms of their ability to read. Only about 18% of Black fourth graders in 2015. That same cohort in 2019, now at eighth grade, only 15% was reading at grade level in 2019. And then in 2023, the same year that the Supreme Court decision made the decision to eliminate race-based affirmative action as a vehicle for college admissions, all indications are less than 20%, again, of that same cohort of Black students are emerging from 12th grade, reading at grade level. That is the fundamental issue. And we can talk about what we can do at college admissions, but it pales in comparison to the ineffective and dismal education outcomes, particularly Black kids and frankly, all kids coming out of our K-12 system.
Yeah, I want to talk about this I want to start backwards and move forwards to some degree, because like many, I think, of my listeners, affirmative action was the law of the land for most of my life. It really wasn't something that we were part of the conversation. It just existed. And I'm curious, if you can kind of help us trace back what the conversation was like, why it was put on the books in the first place. What did the picture look like initially? And then has it, in any way meaningfully addressed what was supposed to? Did we see a better outcome for people of color over the time it was on the books? Obviously, many on the left were very upset when the Supreme Court struck it down, but my personal perspective on it has been that it really didn't work to do what it was supposed to, which was that it was supposed to address systemic racism and all these decades that Black people had been disadvantaged in this country.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good thing to step back and say, why was this created in the first place? Have there been any gains? And does it still need to exist? And one could certainly argue, coming out of the legacy of slavery, the legacy of essentially racism almost being enshrined into law, but those things came to an end with the civil rights legislation of the 60s. And so there was this idea that there were talented particularly Black students entering college who could have a leg up. And this is really important because I think there was this inherent assumption that there was some marginalization, that they were talented, but that they were going to face racial discrimination. And so the government decided to step in and create this leg up for you solely based on skin color. Now, that actually violates the Constitution, but that was the rationale. And to some degree, I think we can declare victory in the sense that over the last 60 years, there's been dramatic improvements of Black and other quote unquote marginalized populations, certainly as it relates to entering college. The reason the Supreme Court made the decision to nullify race-based affirmative action for college admissions is that when you look at the actual data from the two cases, from the Harvard University case and University of North Carolina, the Black kids that were getting in under the affirmative action, race-based affirmative action as it was practiced, 2/3 of those students were recent immigrants, middle to upper class, Black kids who'd been to private school, who'd done well. And so even the way in which race-based affirmative action was being practiced wasn't helping low-income kids who were talented. And so that's the irony. And of course, low-income Asian populations were being discriminated against. The data was clear. And so I think we should say, yes, race-based affirmative action had a role to play over the last 50 to 60 years, but enormous progress has been made. And if we have to have a preference as it relates to college admissions, why not do it based on economic class, so that a low-income white kid that's talented, or a low-income Black kid, or a low-income any kid that has demonstrated academic prowess, that's the kid I think most Americans would agree that should have a leg up as it relates to college admissions, and stop this assumption that because of a certain skin color, you're inherently marginalized, oppressed, and thus deserving of a special leg up.
Yeah, I think I love that point, because I obviously agree that when we talk about diversity, skin color is one of only many, many things that we need to focus on. And I think that it often gets overrated in these conversations, when in reality, we need to look at other kinds of diversity that should maybe be prioritized in these conversations. Another point that you brought up in your tweet that I really liked is the negatives of this kind of stereotyping that have happened along with affirmative action, where many of the kids who have probably very much deserved a spot at these schools have been given the perception of not actually earning it and not deserving to be there. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
No, it is an unfortunate reality, this concept of imposter syndrome, that kids who did deserve to be there, that, there were Black kids in college before affirmative action, right? I mean, most people seem to assume that the only way a Black kid can get into college is if this government intervention exists. And that creates this kind of perverse stereotype that I remember I went to Harvard Business School, and I one of the first essays I wrote at Harvard was listening to two of my Black second-year classmates, Black men, joking that the reason they got into HBS was, quote, "I'm a diversity admit." They were joking, but there was something about how they said it that deep down there was something inside them that gave them a sense that, maybe they didn't belong there. And the thing is, these guys were really talented. And so the more that we remove this idea that you got a special leg up based on this superficial characteristic like skin color, the more we remove this idea that you didn't earn it, that you don't deserve to be there, and that you're all competing on equal footing. I mean, I also went to Brooklyn Tech, which is one of the specialized high schools in New York City, and you had to take a test to get in. And everyone really studied hard for that exam. And when I went to Brooklyn Tech, it was very racially diverse. It was an amazing environment, but everyone in the school knew that you'd earned your slot. But in New York City, there's certain leadership, because they're unhappy with how the racial makeup of who gets in now, they want to eliminate the exam that determines whether or not kids get in. It's a ridiculous intervention, rather than what we should be talking about now. How do you improve the quality of education so that all the kids coming up are able to compete on equal footing? Don't create these artificial interventions at the college admissions level or the high school admissions level, where you're either giving race-based preferences or you're essentially eliminating the objective measures for how one could demonstrate that they're qualified.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I want to talk about next. And I don't want to speak out of pocket here, but you and I are not known to each other. We don't go way back like some of the guests I've had on this show. And so I don't know if you're familiar with some of my other work around this, but I'm somebody on the right who would say that there is systemic racism. I'm somebody who thinks that we should be concerned with some of these issues. And I would say that the public school system is one example of that. My issue when it comes to the topic of race is that on the left, what we often see is another form of racism, right? Where instead of saying, why do we have these disparate outcomes when it comes to different demographics in the US, they instead try to ignore that root cause and try to give certain people a leg up because they don't think that they can do better. And then on the right, you often also have some very seedy underpinnings where people do have racist perceptions on why some demographics might perform better than others. I think that it's really important that we talk about the reasons why Black kids and Hispanic kids are not performing as well as white kids and as Asian kids, and not having the same ability to access some of these institutions based on merit. And I think that you are very well equipped to speak to that. So could you illuminate us on what's going on behind the scenes?
Before we get to the topic of Black and Hispanic kids and their poor performance, it's always important to establish that according to the National Assessment for Educational Progress, among white kids, there has never been a year in which a majority of white kids are reading at grade level. That's really important to establish, right? So even people on the left who say we need to achieve equity and close the racial achievement gap, if we achieved equity, all that would mean is that we've achieved universal mediocrity, right? So the key is that we need to be looking at what are the root causes for why all children are not being successful, and in particular, Black and Hispanic students. And this idea of systemic barriers, it does exist, but let me give you an example for how I define it. So we just launched an international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Soundview section of the Bronx. It's called Vertex Partnership Academies. In this district, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college, right? That means about 2,000 kids in this district start ninth grade, and 4 years later, 93% have either dropped out or they did earn their high school diploma, but still cannot do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college, right? So which is worse? You start high school, you drop out, or you actually do what you're supposed to do, and you still can't compete on equal footing. So that's the situation. But the systemic barrier is that in this district and throughout New York City, there's a cap on public charter schools. So if you had an idea that you wanted to create a great school to provide an empowering alternative for these students, you couldn't get it because elected officials are determined to squash opportunity. So that's a real example of a systemic barrier. But I'll say the preservation of the cap is advocated by white elected officials, by Black elected officials. So is it systemic racism when the people who are standing in the way of opportunity for low-income minority kids also happen to be minority elected officials? So sometimes I concur with you, this idea that there's systemic barriers. What we need to sift through is just, is it systemic racism? Certainly sometimes, but other times it's barriers that are holding everyone back. I just think we need to be honest about what those challenges often are.
Yeah, and I'm 100% with you. I think we need school choice for all. I'm for universal school choice. The reasons I tend to point to systemic racism date more back to redlining and how that continues to determine where kids go and what schools get what kind of funding in the public school system, and how that tends to continue to impact different demographics. And I like one point of your post that you pointed out. You talk about the systemic barriers, you talk about the school system, you also mentioned the family structure. And I think that this is something that's really important. Obviously, when you have an education system that's failing, that compounds over generations and times. But can you talk about, what's happening when it comes to the culture and the sociological issues that we're up against as well?
Yeah, this is where it gets prickly, and folks don't like to talk about this because there's a sense that you're blaming the victim if you talk about family structure. But in the mid-1960s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan ultimately became a senator, produced this really important report on the Negro family. And at the time, there was a thriving Black middle class that was rising and people were excited by, especially given the history in our country. And yet there was a particular component of the Black community that seemed to be entrenched in poverty. And so he decided to write a report about that particular segment and why he thought it was of great concern. And if we don't do something, it could create havoc for that community and others. And at the time, the non-marital birth rate in the Black community was 23.6%. And he honed in on that as a central challenge, the role of fathers, stable families, the social capital that comes from that. He talked about all of these things. And for writing that report, no good deed goes unpunished. He was attacked, he was vilified, and even the term blaming the victim came from the response to that report. The non-marital birth rate today in the Black community is nearly 70%. Almost every social issue that we are concerned with, crime, poverty, maleducation, poor health outcomes, lack of civic engagement, all those things that many of us are concerned about, there is a direct through line back to family structure. And now, this is not only an issue that affects the Black community, the non-marital birth rate in the white community is close to 30%, higher than the crisis levels that Moynihan wrote about in the mid-1960s for the Black community. And so it's what I call an equal opportunity tsunami. Now, it's always important to say that just because a child is born into a single-parent home, that doesn't mean that they're guaranteed failure, nor if a child is born in a married two-parent household, are they guaranteed a life of success. But the data is overwhelming that the conditions to create more likely prosperity for a child are much higher if you're born in a married two-parent household. The poverty rate for Black married couples has been in the single digits for decades. And so this has spillover effect in education, and I just think we have to be honest about it. And some people ask me, so let's say family structure, it does matter. What are you going to do about it? Well, one thing we do in our high school, we teach something called a success sequence, if you're familiar with that terminology. But that's data that says...
Listeners aren't, so please expand.
That's data that says if a young person finishes at least their high school degree, then gets a full-time job of any kind, just that they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and if they have children, if they get married first, 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. Now, it's 97%. It's not 100%. It's not a guarantee. And the way we teach this to the rising generation is that you're the decision maker in your life. You know, we call the period from age 14 to 24 the deciding decade, because the decisions you make during that period of time around relationship, school, education, work, your religious faith will have a huge influence over the quality of the rest of your life. So we try to put our young people in the position that you're making these big decisions. So we're going to give you information. Here's one series of decisions that data says 97% of the time you enter, you avoid poverty, enter the middle class. Here's another series of decisions that says you have far worse outcomes. But the point is you decide. And so I think it's really important to talk about family structure. In all of my work over 30 years in education, young people who've grown up in tough family situations were able to see that their path forward was that it wasn't about the family they were from, it was about the family they were on the pathway to form. Made all the difference.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I really like the action orientation. We often look at what went wrong in the past, but it's meaningful ways that people can start to fix the future, because the only way forward is forward. So I think that that's beautiful. And I love the work that you're doing around this. Can you tell people where they can find you and follow you if they want to get more of the work that you're doing?
Well, you can certainly come visit our school, Vertex Partnership Academies in the Bronx, if you ever actually want to see. Something that's really important is to put ideas into action. So we're not just talking about this. Come to a school where you see how we're creating schools of choice for low-income communities. So you can visit us at vertexacademies.org. You can also follow my work as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And I'm on Twitter at Ian V. Rowe, R-O-W-E.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your perspective on all of this.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. This is a great conversation.
Affirmative action tried to fix racism with more racism, which is silly. Diversity is about a lot more than race and race alone. The New York Post pointed out one of the problems with affirmative action is that in its obsession with racial categories, it might perversely give preferential treatment to an African-American kid whose father is a prominent lawyer and whose mother is a college professor over an Asian American applicant whose parents were refugees from Burma. I think America is about equal opportunity for all, but it is not about equal outcomes. And to achieve that, we have to actually dismantle the systemically racist institutions that were built with the intention of disadvantaging some kids over others. In this case, that would be the public school system. Instead, we have to actually follow our values, empower the American dream, and give individuals control of their destiny back. I think school choice is the answer to all of these problems, not affirmative action. All right, guys, I hope you like this episode. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to this channel if you've not already, and if you want even more content, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok.